A very good afternoon to you all from Geneva. My name is Gemma Parkes, Communications Lead at Friends of Ocean Action, the group of diverse global leaders from a wide range of sectors who are committed to action for a healthy ocean. And I shall be your facilitator for this session today, called Building Ocean Resilience Beyond COVID, Global Call for Collective Action on Fisheries Subsidies. Many thanks to the WTO for offering this opportunity, and thank you all for joining us today. Fishing communities and fish workers have been among those most exposed and vulnerable to the fallout from the global pandemic. And the experience of COVID-19 is a sobering reminder that global challenges can only effectively be met with collective global action. As is well known, especially in these circles, WTO members have a truly once-in-a-lifetime opportunity this year to build the resilience of the world's fisheries by taking collective action to agree new rules on fisheries subsidies once and for all. And it is literally once in a lifetime, as these negotiations have been ongoing now for more than 20 years. In the last 12 months or so especially, though, a growing swell of support has been rising in favor of the elimination of harmful fisheries subsidies, in line with the Sustainable Development Goal for the Ocean, SDG 14, Target 6, agreed unanimously by all heads of state and government in 2015. From the G20 leaders' communiqué last summer to statements from some of the world's leading marine scientists, from the statement by the 14 sitting heads of state of the high-level panel for a sustainable ocean economy, to the UN Secretary General's landmark State of the Planet speech last December, as well as the WTO Director General herself, Dr. Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala, calling for an ambitious agreement this year. Not to mention the small-scale fishers, business leaders and other stakeholders who we at Friends of Ocean Action have gathered in other recent webinars. A plethora of global voices are truly coming together in concert to call for an end to these perverse subsidies that jeopardize the health of the ocean and marine life, as well as the well-being and livelihoods of countless fisher people across coastal communities. Never has there been greater political momentum nor more evidence of the need to act to protect the ocean and the livelihoods of people who depend on it. The time for action is now. So our session today will showcase some views and perspectives from grassroots fisheries stakeholders and ocean advocates about why a harmful fisheries subsidies elimination agreement would help WTO members to reignite confidence in the global rules-based trading regime and contribute to protecting the ocean and people. We'll be looking here specifically at what flexibility means in the context of global action and impact in eliminating harmful fisheries subsidies. And since this is the WTO public forum, we've gathered a range of speakers who engage publicly on this issue around the world. We're joined by, from Madrid, Spain, Remi Parmentier, who is director of the VADA Group and strategic advisor to Friends of Ocean Action, who will discuss a possible flexible approach in the context of the European Union's stated position on fuel subsidies. From Mumbai, India, we're joined by Shailendra Yashwant, an environmental writer and journalist and senior environmental advisor at Climate Action Network South Asia, who will offer his critical but constructive view on the position maintained by his country up to now. From Buenos Aires, Argentina, we're joined by Milko Schwartzman, a lifelong environmentalist and ocean policy coordinator at Círculo de Políticas, who in particular has been chasing and documenting the movements of the Chinese squid fishing fleet in the South Atlantic and Pacific, and we'll discuss China's particular responsibility here. And finally, from London, UK, the panel is completed by Steventrent, Executive Director of the Environmental Justice Foundation and human rights advocate, who will comment on the opportunities at this crossroads of environmental and social considerations for developing countries. The composition of this panel is not formed randomly. It's because India, Latin America, China, and the EU are among those who hold the keys to bringing environmental and social justice into the fisheries subsidies negotiations at the WTO. They can make it or break it. Just 3 weeks ago, on 14th of September, in his speech at the World Conservation Congress of the IUCN in Marseille, WTO Deputy Director General, David Pagam, said the protection of the ocean remains the #1 environmental concern of the WTO. The first and most important is the negotiation for the reform of fisheries subsidies. This is a major environmental, human, and economic issue. Well, at Friends of Ocean Action, we cannot agree more with that statement. WTO Director General Dr. Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala and Ambassador Santiago Wills of Colombia, who chairs the WTO fisheries negotiations, are calling on all WTO members to be flexible in order to ensure an outcome can be reached in the coming weeks and adopted by the WTO's 12th Ministerial Conference, MC12, in December. Now, of course, in any negotiation, everyone needs to give and take. But what can flexibility really entail in this context? Can we be sure that flexibility won't devoid the agreement of its substance, or that it will maintain the critical environmental integrity? We'd like to address these questions with you all today. We'll first hear from our panelists and hope to have a little time left for interactive dialogue if we can. And we strongly encourage you to please share your comments and questions via the Q&A box, and we'll do our best to get to those at the end with what time remains. So without further ado, let's get started. First up, we have Remi Parmentier, who has participated in several of our past webinars on harmful fisheries subsidies. He is French by origin and has long been based in Spain, at the heart of the EU fishing industry. Remi, I'd like to ask you specifically about the role of the European Union in this process. In fact, the EU is currently sponsoring an open-air photo exhibition here on the shores of Lake Geneva, I spotted the other day, on the merits of multilateralism, and where, for example, they seem to champion in particular the elimination of harmful fisheries subsidies at the WTO. Is this really so? And is there anything else the EU could do to convince WTO membership? Remi, over to you.
Thank you, Gemma. I hope you and everybody can hear me. Yes. Thank you for the opportunity to speak again at a webinar on harmful fisheries subsidies and the WTO. In his statement to the special ministerial meeting on fisheries subsidies convened on 15 July 2021, just a few weeks ago, convened by the WTO Director General, the EU Commission Executive Vice President Dombrovskis made a series of points. One of these was that, and I quote, fuel is an issue that affects many WTO members, end of quote. Well, we know that the EU, particularly the EU, considers it a problem to eliminate fuel subsidies and tax rebates, which are nevertheless considered harmful fisheries subsidies because they contribute to overcapacity. In particular, these fuel subsidies and tax rebates allow the EU fleet, like others, to travel long distance. Fuel subsidies are also at odds with in certain ways with the EU climate goals and the EU green goal, the Green Deal. In another part of the EU executive vice president's statement, reference is also made to, and I quote, which type of fishing can benefit flexibility, end of quote. So I assume that in saying this, he was suggesting that the most destructive types of fishing, we more commonly use the expression fishing practices, destructive fishing practices should not be subsidized. So acknowledging that a blanket ban on fishing fuel subsidies may be something hard to swallow in the current context for a number of EU countries and stakeholders, here is a proposal. The EU could announce its determination to eliminate fuel subsidies for destructive fishing methods, in particular for deep sea bottom trawling, which not only is considered extremely destructive, non-selective, causing irreversible damage to marine ecosystems, etc., but also an extremely fuel-hungry practice because it takes a lot of energy to pull and lift the huge nets that are used for bottom trawling. So the EU could propose that banning high seas bottom trawling subsidies forms part of the WTO agreement. But if this is not possible, with the little time that is left, they should implement this measure at EU scale unilaterally. That's the proposal. This would be an effective way for the EU to implement SDG 14 Target 6, but also some of the other SDG 14 targets as well concerning marine biodiversity conservation. This would be a great confidence building measure, showing that the EU is serious about eliminating harmful fisheries subsidies, about protecting marine biodiversity within and beyond marine protected areas, and implementing the Sustainable Development Goal number 14. Thank you very much, Gemma. I'm glad to have the opportunity to submit this thought to you all.
Thanks to you, Remi. Thanks for this interesting idea and contribution. Well, as Remi works closely with us at Friends of Ocean Action, of course, his thought does not come as a surprise to me, but I think it's certainly worth sharing here for our collective perusal in this discussion. Next, I'd like to turn to Shailendra Yashwant. Shai, I've read recently in the Indian daily newspaper, The Hindu, that your government is planning to expand its industrial fisheries fleet through a program called Matsya Sampada Yojana, and I apologize if I'm not pronouncing that correctly. At the same time, the Indian delegation at the WTO always says that their reservations with regards to an agreement on fisheries subsidies are because of concerns that their small-scale artisanal fisheries would suffer. So where do you see the truth as lying?
Thank you, Gemma. Thank you, everyone. First of all, let me just express my excitement at Remi's proposal. I think it's a brave idea, and if something like that happens, if EU goes ahead and does something like that and sets an example, I think it will have a far-reaching effect. So, Remi, all power to you and all those who are proposing this. Let's push such ideas forward. That said, on flexibility, at this point of negotiations, I'm sure environmental integrity is not something that is going to be negotiated at all. Flexibility, yes, given the impacts of pandemic, given the fact that increasingly fishermen are suffering multiple distresses, both economic and otherwise, whether it's climate induced or pandemic induced, or just a fall in fish catch. Fishermen everywhere in the world are deeply impacted, and any assistance and any help, anything that WTO can do at this stage to ensure both sides of protecting the oceans as well as helping our fishermen recover their livelihood is absolutely essential. And I hope that negotiations, as they move forward, pressure on that. On your specific questions, Gemma, Matsya Sampada Yojana, yet another scheme in India to help. Just as a background, for 75 years, in fact, since independence, all the subsidies in India are essentially aimed towards increasing production, and that is done by fuel subsidy, as Remi has already pointed out. One of the very sensitive issues around fuel subsidies. We can go into details later, but fuel subsidies and fishing care, as it happens, it's the big fishermen, it's the big trawler owners who get the bigger chunk, the bigger percentage of the subsidies. And with the with that subsidized fuel, they are part of the problem. The poor, the marginalized, the artisanal, the small fishermen gets a very small cut of any of these schemes, any of the subsidies that are put forward. So what I'm trying to say is, even for India, flexibility will come from actually trying to fix the skewed subsidy system that we have. And I think this is not only true of India, it's true of most of the South Asian countries where I have documented and reported these issues from. And they're linked, and we need brave ideas out there, like the one Remi suggested. So I'll stop here. I just want to say that let's not confuse yet another scheme from Government of India to be, really driven for uplifting our marginal fishermen. It is driven towards increasing production. Now the production is more focused towards aquaculture, towards fish meal and fish oil industries. A large percentage of our agricultural land is now being converted into aquaculture. So it's the farmers who will probably gain from this scheme more than the fishermen. So not to confuse this issue, more later. Thank you, Gemma.
Thank you very much for that, Shai. And so if I understand your analysis correctly, it sounds like this current scheme that's been mentioned, Matsya Sampada Yojana, is in a way synonymous with harmful fisheries subsidies, exactly what the Indian government, along with others in the Sustainable Development Goals, have agreed to ask the WTO to eliminate. Isn't that the opposite kind of flexibility that's needed to reach consensus in this agreement over the final weeks of 2021?
Yeah, it's like I said, it's a fine line. It's when you are saying that we are going to protect our fishermen and improve their livelihood opportunities. What are we doing? Are we improving their livelihood opportunities, or are we just creating another set of profit-making opportunities for the big fishermen? That's what I hear from the artisanal fishermen, from fishermen's unions that I have spoken to. For them, at this point in time, and this I have repeatedly heard and I have repeatedly said, fish meal and fish oil industry and the aquaculture industry is the big white elephant when it comes to the impact of fisheries on the environment, as well as the impact of fisheries on livelihoods and human rights in India. So yet another scheme to, without, of course, all of this is export oriented, Gemma. Let's be clear. Most of our fishing industry is again geared towards exports. So it's also about the global consumption patterns that need to be talked about. And that's why I keep saying fish meal, fish oil, aquaculture, these industries are the white elephants and that need more attention as well. Thank you, Gemma.
Thank you so much, Shai. There's so much more that we could talk about there, but hopefully we'll have time to come back a little bit later in the Q&A section. Thank you so much for that. As time is racing, I propose that we turn for now to Milko Schwartzman, our next panelist, the environmental whistleblower from Argentina, who spends his time chasing and monitoring fishing vessels, flying the flags of the People's Republic of China, Chinese Taipei, and other countries in international waters in the South Atlantic, and also in the Pacific, in the vicinity of the Galapagos Islands. Hola, Milko. Thanks for joining us today. Please tell us, in accordance with Sustainable Development Goal 14, Target 6, adopted 6 years ago, subsidies to illegal, unreported, and unregulated fishing should have been eliminated by 2020 at the latest, of course, but they continue in your part of the world. Is your understanding that China and other countries you find fishing over there are subsidized by their respective flag states? Milko, over to you.
Thank you, Gemma. Thanks to all the audience. Well, that's right. When we speak about harmful fisheries subsidies, There is immense social and environmental impacts in South America. Fishing, as you know, is a key food source and the main income for many communities through Ecuador, Colombia, Chile in the Pacific, and for example, for Brazilian, Uruguayan, and Argentina communities in the Atlantic. And it's also one of the few pillars that sustain the national economy of countries like Peru, for example. Peru's economy depends on fishing. And flag state subsidized distant water fishing fleets are increasing every year in our region. The fishing fleets, foreign fishing fleets, amount for about 1,000 factory ships catching the same fish populations that feed local people. The EU, China, South Korea, and Chinese Taipei are the 4 fleets that use industrialized factory vessels, and those fleets are extracting, without any regulation, billions of dollars and billions of meals from the border of for economic exclusive zones, and also sometimes from inside the EEZ. For just talking about a few examples, last year in Argentina, in just 5 days, the Coast Guard captured 3 vessels doing IUU fishing inside the Argentina EEZ. Those 3 vessels were part of a bigger fleet that get inside the Argentina EEZ, and 2 of those vessels were Chinese and 1 Portuguese. This is just for give an example in my country. But for example, talking about the Pacific, since 2017, the World Heritage Site of the Galapagos Islands has been harassed by a fleet of more than 300 Chinese shiggers, which ended with the capture of a factory vessel that was loaded with hammerhead shark and other endangered species. Last year, as you may know, the situation reached worldwide news, and local communities in the Galapagos are now mobilized. Other case in 2018, for example, Brazilian fishermen clashed with Chinese vessels near Brazilian EEZ, or more recently in 2019, Uruguayan local communities rejected the building of a Chinese port that was planned to be built on protected lines in Uruguay. And talking about cases and giving just some statistics, for example, in the last 6 years in Argentina, there was an average of 2.5 fishing vessels caught per year because IUU. China leads the ranking, but there are also some South Korean and Spanish vessels that were captured because of IUU. In the case from another case just in front of Argentina in the La Plata River, for example, according to Uruguayan official reports, foreign fishing fleets lands 1 dead crew member per month at the port of Montevideo. Many of the casualties happen because of lack of minimum sanitary conditions or treatment on board. Like, for example, people that have died because of a toothache. So this is unbelievable. So, and the most cases happen on Chinese vessels that are the more responsible for deceased crew members and denounces of forced labor.
Thank you for sharing, Milko. Those are sobering points indeed. I mean, with all that in mind, what would you say would be the implications across your region if the WTO fails to reach a subsidies elimination agreement before or at MC12 later this year?
Well, unreported and unregulated industrialized subsidized foreign fleets compete with the artisanal fishing fleets on the same species and in the same fishing grounds. And for example, with the foreign fishing fleets that fish for jumbo squid in the Pacific. These fleets not only have advantages of subsidies, they have other harmful subsidies too. For example, foreign fleets doesn't comply with any safety at sea environmental or sanitary rule. They don't comply with labor regulations and have plenty of denunciations and casualties because of human rights abuses on board. They have long records of IUU fishing inside coastal states. The majority of the vessels operate in stealth mode, especially those from China. I mean, turning their AIS off, for example. And foreign fishing fleets doesn't provide any reliable data on what they catch, where, when, and how. So this is an environmental time bomb. This is one of the more dangerous things. We don't know what's going on the water. Added to that, there is the Latin American countries increasing budget for patrolling by air and sea to prevent those fleets from getting inside the EEZs. So there are millions of dollars that are being taken from local needs on, for example, education or health, and used to preserve the marine environment and the sovereignty from the threats of subsidized and often illegal fishing fleets. I think that allowing the subsidies to those fleets is like taking food from the mouths of coastal communities. It's increasing unemployment, causing unpredictable environmental harm, and taking away the possibilities of local economies to develop. Right now, it's an historical moment for the WTO, for representatives, and for world-leading states, such as China, for example, to show that they can act as the circumstances deserve. Our communities and our ocean needs a robust and a reliable agreement.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for sharing your insights, Milko. I think often we refer to them as harmful fisheries subsidies, but they're also often called perverse fisheries subsidies. And I think you've illustrated so starkly the perversity of the situation. And it does indeed seem to be an environmental as well as a social time bomb. So let's hope action is taken this year by the community, the global community, to be true to SDG 14 as all world leaders agreed. Thanks so much, Milko. Our last speaker is Steve Trent. Before I introduce Steve, I would just love to remind those who are participating and listening in online or indeed in person, since this is a hybrid event, please do pop any comments or questions into the Q&A function through the WTO Public Forum interface, and we'll do our best to get to those in a little while. Steve Trent's Executive Director of the Environmental Justice Foundation, and you may also recognize him from a couple of our past webinars. Hi there, Steve. We've asked you to join us again at a time when some WTO members are specifically discussing the interconnection between environmental and social justice in relation to fisheries subsidies. I expect we've all heard some of the distressing reports, some of which Milko just mentioned as well, of forced labor and people trafficking on certain fishing fleets, not to mention the impact of distant water industrial fishing on smaller scale coastal fishing communities. And in fact, one of our other recent webinars last year was in partnership with the Environmental Justice Foundation, where we showed a new short film on the direct impact in fishing communities like Ghana of industrial subsidized fleets that leave nothing left for local communities. What would you say, Steve, regarding the links between harmful fisheries subsidies and human rights abuses?
Well, thanks very much, Gemma, and thanks Friends of Ocean Action and the WTO for allowing me to speak today. Just before I start, I too would like to commend the proposal from Remi for the EU to show its determination and leadership in this. I think that's an outstanding proposal. And also just to comment very briefly on what Milko said, where he was referencing the human rights impact, if you like, of some of these subsidies. And we work in multiple geographies around the world. We're monitoring different fleets, different vessels all the time. And I could say across those geographies, from Ghana to Taiwan, Liberia to Thailand, we see the same thing happening, that fleets that are heavily subsidized are experiencing extensive human rights and labor abuses across their operations. And sometimes these are driven in direct and less direct ways by those subsidies. So that my broad comments today are very simple, very direct. And I think we can say that after decades of action, decades of effort, we can now see the real opportunity for the WTO to phase out harmful fisheries subsidies. And I think we need to put that in the context of understanding that for every day we wait longer We will continue to see fish populations negatively impacted. We will continue to see the impacts on coastal communities that will lose vital livelihoods, food security, and while the ecological security of our global ocean is further undermined. I'd also like to say things which I know the audience will know, but I think they're worth recalling. And when we look at global fisheries subsidies, of the approximately $35 billion that are spent every year, we can say, give or take, 60% can legitimately be called harmful, meaning they're linked to overcapacity, overfishing, and illegal fishing. And what we see in our work is that with those abuses, there's also a very common connection to labor and human rights abuses, including forced, bonded, and slave labor. So you have interconnected issues here that are being fed and fueled by these subsidies. Another key point, very simple, but I think many of us will have witnessed this, I've certainly seen it firsthand, is how these fishery subsidies support industrial trawlers to hoover up the catch of small-scale fishers who can't compete with the artificially low costs of these large industrial vessels and are witness to their livelihoods being ruined and their food security taken away. On a recent trip to Ghana, I was standing in one of the main artisanal ports, and you could watch 10 men go out in a boat and come back with a tiny amount, half a bucket of fish, as big industrial vessels were operating off the shore and their subsidized vessels taking the lion's share of the catch. I think it's very important in this to note that other nations provide twice as much funding for their vessels via subsidies to fish in African waters than African nations do themselves. All they're doing is exporting the risks of unsustainable overfishing to countries that can least afford it. So going back and touching on a real life current illustration of what this means, fairly recent research that EJF has conducted, again in Ghana, found that over half the people employed in fisheries across coastal communities in Ghana had gone without sufficient food in the last year as a result of increasing overfishing and illegal fishing, and even more had seen their income decline. And again, much of this is driven by, plainly and simply, by harmful fisheries subsidies. So it's in this way we can see that these subsidies are an assault on the well-being and basic human rights of many in primarily developing countries, I would say, just as they represent this needless, self-defeating attack on the sustainability of global fisheries. So we could see that by ending them, there would be multiple benefits for human rights, food security, local communities, alongside the very well-known ecological benefits and indeed economic benefits that I won't rehearse again here. Last couple of points very quickly to say, I think it would be a mistake to assume that this is only a problem for some nations, though. Continued overfishing and resulting decline in global fisheries threatens long-term supplies for all. It also has impacts for our ambitions to combat global heating, as it further undermines the most important global ecosystem in the climate regulation, and that is our ocean. And I want to reference Ambassador Peter Thompson again in this, where he has said repeatedly and very eloquently that ending harmful fisheries would very likely represent the single most effective near-term action that we can take. And I would add, quite easily take, to turn around the decline of our ocean environments. So my call today, my plea, if you like, is for the members of the WTO to be flexible, understand the many complementary benefits to be had from banning harmful subsidies, specifically including those for the advancement and benefit of human rights in the seafood sector. But agree this deal now, as it stands, and then see what more can be done to go on and protect both fisheries and fishers' rights. The action that's needed has long been clear, And it's equally clear that the genuine ambition and global leadership from nations at the WTO to end harmful fisheries subsidies will be applauded across our world for generations to come as they benefit and we remove this near-term threat. So thank you very much for listening to my short points today, and back to you, Gemma.
Thank you so much, Steve. That's a very powerful message to WTO members that eliminating harmful fisheries subsidies will not only help vulnerable fish populations, but also people in vulnerable communities. That couldn't be clearer. And I love that you quoted Ambassador Peter Thompson, who is also Friends of Ocean Action co-chair. And in fact, he's called overfishing a social injustice, and that ending harmful fisheries subsidies is the best way to bring that to an end. In fact, we just posted on our Twitter feed that article earlier today at Friends of Ocean. Please do check that out and share it with your networks. Before we move on, we have a little bit of time for some Q&A. Thanks again to our speakers for your interventions. And Remi, I wanted to go back to you, if I may. I've heard some positive reception of your proposal. I wonder if you have any initial feedback to the comments from our other panelists on that.
Well, I'm wondering whether Ursula von der Leyen or Mr. Timmermans or Virginijus Sinkevicius, the EU Commissioner for the Environment and Ocean, are listening. And I know they're very busy, so they're probably not online. But what I would like to suggest is I'm very encouraged by the reception that this proposal is receiving, and maybe those who agree that it's a good idea might want to communicate to the EU Commission and to the EU mission in Geneva that this is a very practical opportunity for the EU to push the envelope and at the same time protect marine biodiversity and support the implementation of SDG 14.6. So that's my reaction. And maybe, there are many ways to communicate these ideas to the EU Commission and the member states also, who at the end of the day have the stick or the carrot that can encourage the EU delegation to do the right thing. So here we go. Here you go.
Thank you. Thanks, Remi, for those reactions. So we have a little bit of time for some Q&A. Again, I would encourage anyone who has a burning question that they would like to pose to our panelists, please do put it in the Q&A function on the public forum interface. But we have a couple of questions that have come in. And the first is from someone who really expresses, I guess, supports a lot of the messages we've been hearing today about how often it seems to be large-scale industrial subsidized vessels that sort of win the day, and then the smaller scale fisherfolk who are really left to just fend for themselves, and there's not much justice in there at all. We've spoken about that quite a bit today, but I wonder whether perhaps Shai, from what you've observed, is there anything that you would add there about how we can, as this person says, the biggest subsidizers are trying to use the negotiations at the WTO to potentially lock in an unequal system. How can we make sure that poorer fisherfolk are getting a fair deal and that their interests are being heard?
Gemma?
Yeah, Shai, please.
Hi. Yeah. Well, let me throw out an unpopular opinion here. I think the best deal goes to the consumer. It's really, at the end of the day, those of us who are sitting wherever we are sitting and eating fish from far, far away, we are the biggest winners in this whole game, because like Steve illustrated so well, it's not as if the big trawler guys are leading a happy life either. I mean, there's all kinds of miseries written in the whole fishing industries, if you look at that. So the biggest winner will always be the consumer, and the consumer has to start paying attention to where their fish is coming from, start asking these questions. And I think we need to build, that public pressure as well for, even for WTO to achieve what it has set out to achieve and has taken 20 years to reach where it has reached. So for each country, there's a different thing. But for me, at this point in time, I feel very strongly that the role of the consumer in this whole, game of overfishing and the whole thing, should not be underplayed. I think we should put it up front as well, Gemma.
Absolutely. No, thanks so much for that, Shay. I think that's a very fundamental point. And absolutely, I think increasingly we are certainly observing that there is growing awareness and demand for reform from the general public, from consumers. And I think one way of that people can do that is by expressing their demand for both environmentally and socially fair and sustainable fish and seafood products through picking eco-label. For example, the Marine Stewardship Council is one. There are others they're a member of the Friends of Ocean Action group. But I think increasingly consumer power is definitely coming to the fore in this, as with other areas. Don't know whether any of our other panelists would like to add something to that point. Remi, go ahead.
Well, I also saw Steve raising his hand, but with your permission, Steve, just a couple of points. Coming back to the EU and your question, Gemma, and on my suggestion that the EU should stop subsidizing destructive fishing methods such as deep sea bottom trawling. When the current EU Commission was appointed, that was 2 years ago, 2019, Ursula von der Leyen, the president of the Commission, sent to all her commissioners a letter of mission, stating their priorities. And in her letter of mission to the EU Commissioner for the Environment and Ocean, Sinkevicius, she says, I want you to conclude the fisheries negotiations at the WTO by 2020. Well, we're in 2021, so it's long overdue. And what we're suggesting, is part of the, not only of concluding the negotiations, but making sure that harmful fisheries subsidies are eliminated from the practice. That's the first thing I wanted to say. And then your question about India, of course, Shai is the master, but I maybe it's a question to Shai, actually. Right? Yes, I should frame it as a question to Shai rather than as a statement. The SDGs, especially the SDG, the Sustainable Development Goal on poverty and on food, are top priorities for your Prime Minister Modi. And it is stated so in their policy. How can they, on the one hand, say the SDGs are a priority, and on the other, continue to undermine a SDG 14, Target 6, which is very much a food security issue, as we've seen. How do they manage to get away with this in India? That's my question. Thank you.
Shai, please.
My God, that's a difficult question. But let's have Steve say his bit before I gather myself and respond to Remi. Steve, please.
Please go ahead, Steve. I think you're going to.
Okay. Yeah, just a few quick points. I think something I said briefly is absolutely true. We have to see full cost internalization, and unfortunately, that does mean that particularly in the highly commercialized, wealthy, developed markets of the world, we have to pay more for our fish. It's as simple as that. We can't rely on these harmful subsidies. Consumers have to take full account of how that fish is produced and what the impacts are of it. So that was my first very simple point. I think the consumer has been the winner, and we've got to look at this. So it's a message to communicate back to the major markets. And then the second point, which echoing Remi, where reading and recalling very clearly those letters that were sent by the President of the Commission to her commissioners. And I think they were bold and ambitious. I applaud them. But now we have to fulfill the ambition. It's as simple as that. I understand that there have been things that have got in the way, not least COVID-19 and other issues. But now we have this opportunity before us. It is present and tangible and reachable. So if the EU can lead, that will be doing many things for the world over and above securing that cost internalization I was talking about, perhaps in a different way in its own market.
Absolutely. No, thanks a lot, Steve. And I would love to actually also ping that question generally about consumer pressure and views to Milko, if I may, and if you have any further views on that, particularly from your regional standpoint, then I'll coming back to you, Shai.
No worries.
Thank you, Gemma. Well, recently I've been studying about traceability, talking about markets, consumers, as Steve and Shai mentioned. And every year there are new regulations about traceability on different countries. Even China has traceability regulations, the US, UK, Japan, the EU. So the consumer in the short term will choose what to eat and will pay even more, knowing that their food comes from a regulated fishery, for example. So I think if we don't have a strong an agreement that fully comply with SDG 14.6, at the end there will be no fish. I mean, a strong agreement will benefit everyone, even the industrialized fishing fleets. So I think that everyone eyes are over the worldwide leaders right now. This is a special moment down here in Latin America. You can read on the newspapers about the WTO agreement. I mean, for people, the WTO is not a popular organization, but right now it became that because our countries, our main media is focused on regulated fishing fleets around South America. So our eyes and our hopes are on them. So we hope to celebrate something that will be good for everyone at the end of the year.
Absolutely, that's really encouraging to hear, and certainly couldn't agree more. Thanks, Milko. Shai, I'd love to come back to you, if I may, with Remi's very good question about, we at Friends of Ocean Action, we often talk about SDG 14+, by which we mean that by achieving all the targets, in fact, of this Sustainable Development Goal for the ocean, but especially eliminating harmful fisheries subsidies. Of course, it's good for the ocean, but it's also good for job security, food security, and many other of the SDGs that are so critical to sustainable development. How would you have any comments on that potential incongruity from your perspective that you see?
Gemma, Remi, I must say this. I think until 2 years ago, and Remi, you have been following the negotiations much closely, India had almost cracked it. We were almost in line. That's why we are where we are at in the negotiations. The pandemic has set back a lot of good intentions and good plans, is what my understanding by speaking to those in the circles that are private to the discussions. That said, there is no compromise, and everything that has been said earlier by Milko and Steve and you, I think at this point, pushing for any short-term solution and missing how we our SDGs. And I'm sure, Remi, you are also referring to the new proposal that came out last week from the Indian delegation on accessibility. I think at this stage, the Indian government will have to look at both its commitments for rule-based regimes. Our Prime Minister referred to it also in the US the other day, that they want a more rule-based regime, and its commitment to conservation and climate change, which is another thing that they keep talking about. So I think somewhere we are hoping somewhere all these will intersect and converge, and we might, we hope common sense prevails, not only in India, but everywhere. And like everyone else, I'm also very, very keen that India is not seen in any way as someone who's going to delay this historic agreement when we reach it.
Indeed. No, thanks so much, Shai. Remi, please.
Thank you for this explanation, Shai. That's useful. As Gemma knows, I'm going to have to leave for another meeting in just a few minutes. So I wanted to add one element to the discussion, with your permission. As you all know, the WTO is also now pledging to contribute to other trade-related aspects of the environmental crisis. They're talking of climate change. So, for example, subsidies in the fossil fuel sector. They're talking of plastic trade, etc. I cannot leave this room without saying that unless they comply with SDG 14.6 on harmful fishery subsidies, unless they conclude the negotiations that started 20 years ago, for Christ's sake, 20 years ago, an entire human generation. Unless they do that this year, frankly, what credibility will they have when they say, oh, we're going to regulate and stop fossil fuel subsidies and plastic trade, the proliferation of plastics in the environment and so on? I mean,
indeed. Thank you, Remi. And I want to steal one more minute of your time. I know that you need to dash for another commitment, but we had a question coming in on whether any of our panelists have any particular thoughts on the current negotiating draft text that's on the table. So what's concretely being negotiated in these final weeks? Do you have any particular reflections on that?
Well, I think you, in your introduction, Gemma, you said flexibility, of course. Yeah, in a negotiation, people have to give and take, but it's not flexibility at all costs. It cannot be at the cost of reaching an agreement that would would be emptied of its substance. And that's a very strong message that needs to be maintained in the final hours of the negotiations. And I say, hopefully, the final hours of the negotiations. So there are several options, and the text, what is good is that the text has been made publicly available. In previous occasions, especially the previous ministerial conference that took place in 2017, we had to rely on leaked versions and leaked documents by and large. And I think Dr. Ngozi and indeed Ambassador Santiago Wills, who chairs the negotiations, should be commended for securing a much more transparent process, and hopefully that will lead to an agreement that can work for the fish and that can work for the WTO. And if some improvements need to be made, certainly in the future, I think that every 2 years would be the way to go, and certainly not every 10 years, as one country has suggested some time ago. I really need to go now.
Indeed. Thank you so much.
Thank you very
Remi.
much. Thank you for the opportunity.
Thanks, Remi, for joining us. And that was some very good suggestions there, including the need to scrutinize quite closely. Once a deal is reached this year, we will certainly be monitoring closely ourselves at Friends of Ocean Action, and I'm sure across our panelists, to keep a close watch on what happens, and check indeed that it's working. So we are reaching the end of this session very soon, with just a few minutes left. I think my main takeaway thoughts are that we as a global community do have a collective responsibility to get this done. It's on our watch, so we're really relying on WTO members and behind you in this process to reach a deal this year. And I feel that there is hope. As His Excellency Cyril Ramaphosa, President of the Republic of South Africa, stated in the public forum opening plenary just earlier today, in quoting Nelson Mandela, "It always seems impossible until it is done." There are a few minutes left. I'd love to ask any of our panelists that are still with us for a final thought or brief comment, please, that you may have in parting for the WTO negotiators, if I may. Perhaps, Steve, could I come to you first? What would your parting message be?
Parting shot, talking to the title of this session about flexibility, would be to say flexibility is fine, but it must come with the elimination of these subsidies. So the flexibility should be looking at the opportunity to approach other issues in other superficially different sectors. So when we're talking about human rights and the well-being of local communities, but the heart of this is it must impact those subsidies. There's no excuse for not dealing with that. There's very little wiggle room in the negotiations or anything else. And then the last thing, if you'll allow me just to say, and I know, again, our audience knows this, but we have to remember 90% of our global marine fisheries are now fished at or beyond sustainable levels. And at the same time, 3.2 billion people depend upon fisheries as a primary source of protein. And these fisheries are in crisis. So referring back again to Ambassador Thompson, this is an action that we can take on our watch, to use your phrase, and which will have a massive global shared benefit.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Steve. Milko, may I come to you? What would your any last words be?
Thank you, Gemma. Well, I kept thinking of what Remi mentioned, like flexibility, but not at any cost. And when we are talking about cost, we are talking about food, not just money. It will be food. I mean, we are going to pay the cost in the next years. I mean, we need a good agreement. And as Steve mentioned, that the agreement needs to address those subsidies we were talking about today. And well, for closing, I think that this is a huge challenge for the WTO. The world is watching, and we expect that the representatives are going to be up to the circumstances. Thank you.
Indeed.
Thank you, all the audience.
Many thanks, Milko. And Shai, if I may come to you in 10 seconds, if you could, what would be your parting message?
Old Greenpeace graffiti, I remember. Empty seas, empty future. I think that's something, that's all I want to say. Empty seas, empty future. Let's remember that and move forward. Thank you,
That
Gemma.
sums it up.
Thank you, Steve.
That thanks sums it up so well. Thank you so much, Shai. Thanks to all of our panelists and all of you indeed for following the session. Please follow us on Twitter at Friends of Ocean and watch out for news and comment also on our website, friendsofoceanaction.org. Note also that tomorrow at 1500 hours CET, there's another panel on fisheries subsidies, session 35, organised by Pew and IASD. So the conversation does continue. And of course, we all very much hope to be in a position to celebrate the adoption of a WTO harmful fisheries subsidies elimination agreement in just a few weeks. Let's see. Well, enjoy the rest of the public forum event. Thank you very much again and goodbye. Take care.